Today brings together world leaders at COP, country leaders. But while countries need to take the lead, solving the climate crisis and ensuring we get to net zero emissions by 2050 globally is not up to them alone. Companies, cities, and other non-state actors play a critical role. And many have pledged to become net zero and have certain targets, but are they doing enough of the right things to achieve their pledges? Experts on these questions are now in our studio in Dubai with Andrea Lindblom, who will be hosting this session based on her extensive experience of the business perspective of climate action. So I hand it over to you, Andrea.
Thank you so much, Katarina, and a warm welcome to COP28 here from Dubai. How can we make sure that companies take real action and fast to do their bit so that we get to the global net zero that we need to see in order to still have a livable planet for all? That's what we're going to be talking about today in the session organized by the Exponential Roadmap Initiative. And joining me here on stage are Anna Åkesson of Skanska, Thomas Hale of Oxford University, we have John Lang of the Energy, Climate and Intelligence Unit, and Johan Falk, CEO of the Exponential Roadmap Initiative. And coming up shortly, we should have Arunabha Ghosh, CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. So stay tuned for him to join this panel. Bringing integrity and accountability to net zero pledges and targets of companies, of cities, of financial institutions, of non-state actors, in short, that was the core aim of a set of recommendations that were launched last year at COP27. And that was by an expert group that the UN Secretary General had convened. Now, John, you lead a project that tracks net zero commitments, but your net zero stocktake shows pretty, well, let's say mixed results. What are the main sticking points there?
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. Yes, I've got the great privilege of running the Net Zero Tracker on behalf of the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, Oxford Net Zero, that Tom is a member of, and New Climate Institute in Germany, and the Data-Driven Envirolab in the US. So yes, what we did find in our June stocktake is that there's great movement on intent. So corporate intent is still moving forward really well, but what we are finding is the sticking points around integrity. And so to bring out one statistic we found, we looked at all our entities, our 2,000 biggest publicly listed companies, and only 4% met minimum procedural requirements for good net zero. And those minimum procedural requirements are pretty simple. They're taken from the Race to Zero starting line. They are pledge, have a plan to deliver on that pledge, proceed immediately with emission reductions, and to publish annually, but also to cover all Scope 3 emissions and to clarify what you're doing on offsets. And so what we found is that only 1 in 20 of these companies were actually satisfying those minimum procedural requirements.
Thank you, John. Now, Anna, you represent Skanska, a multinational construction company and a member of the Exponential Roadmap Initiative and the Race to Zero campaign, for that matter. Maybe you can explain what are the challenges that you come up against to take the action, the fast, the credible action that's needed for true net zero?
I think what we can start with is, as you finished off, true net zero. What is actually true net zero? And as a company full of engineers, and I'm one of them, so I can say that we're full of them, we want to have proof before we start setting targets of where we're going and why. And I would say that for Scope 1 and 2, it's fairly straightforward. We know what to do, we have control of the emissions, and it's a straightforward way forward. But when it comes to Scope 3, it's really complex, both because what is actually Scope 3? What does it include? What do we have control of? What do we initiate or not? And I think that's where we see the biggest challenge. The standardization or lack of harmonization around Scope 3 creates difficulties and challenges in how to be able to move forward and set targets and actually measure up against something.
And Johan from the Exponential Roadmap Initiative that works with members like Skanska here to ensure that they take credible action, also hold them accountable. How does that work?
Well, as a frontline initiative, what we basically do is that before we onboard a company, and we do this regularly every year as well, is actually to bring the company through what we call the climate performance review. That review is based on the foundation of our business playbook and the 4-pillar framework. So it's about our own emissions, value chain emissions. It's about scaling solutions. It's about contributing to climate action in society. And we basically integrate the Race to Zero 3.0 requirements as part of that framework, as well as the H-leg requirements. And our idea is also to go in the front line to help influence and to actually to contribute to the next generation standards with some of the frontline companies. And then, of course, we provide advice back to the companies of the key gaps, how they can actually move even faster. And the final idea is basically, can we create some general guidelines or action guides that we can actually scale out openly to other companies, any other type of companies? So that's what we're doing.
Thanks. And just to explain, HLEG refers to this high-level expert group of for the net zero commitments of non-state actors. That was this expert group convened by the UN Secretary General that presented their report, Integrity Matters, last year at COP. Now, Tom Hale, we already heard about companies, we heard about initiatives, and your work really concerns the system that governs, or let's say controls, net zero. There's more to the system than the companies and the initiatives. How does this system work?
So I think what the system works by first drawing on this groundswell of activity we see described through initiatives like Exponential Roadmap Initiative, like companies like Skanska, through the Race to Zero campaign, and then orchestrated through initiatives to try to get them to look at what good net zero looks like. And that's really powerful because it creates innovation, it shows it's possible, and it creates support for the outcome we all want to work toward. But obviously, voluntary targets only get us so far. We need them to innovate and to drive forward best practice, but they don't bring everyone on board because there's always companies that aren't going to join. And in the Net Zero Tracker, we showed that this year, 1,000 of the top 2,000 companies now have a net zero target. But that means that still in 2024, 1,000 don't have a target. And that's really a problem for climate change. So we need regulation to come in and pick up where voluntary action is taking us in the right direction. And you think about this as kind of like a conveyor belt, if you will, from best practice coming through the voluntary efforts and then getting built into regulation that brings the whole economy on board.
And we'll get to more of that in a minute, but I'd like to bring on the stage now Arunabha Ghosh, who I've introduced before as the CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, and a member of this high-level expert group that's also come up before. Welcome, Arunabha. So coming back to the work that your group did, there's something going wrong here. Oh, right. Arunabha needs a microphone, so that's great. Thank you. So the aim was to bring integrity and accountability to this net zero space, and you were among the members of this expert group. If you had to cut it down to the 3 main points of this comprehensive report, what are the main points?
Make a pledge. Make sure that the pledge is backed up with near-term targets, and make sure your actions are verified independently. I mean, those are really the main recommendations coming out of Integrity Matters. But of course, there's a lot more underlying each of those.
Thank you so much for that. We want to go back to Tom here to look at this governance system that you explain and set out as being sort of like a conveyor belt where things move from ideas to voluntary initiatives to then these campaigns like the Race to Zero that we already have, to then maybe standards and regulation. You touched on this a little bit already, but what is missing from the system to make net zero better?
Well, I think it's really missing speed, which is the most important thing we have to do now. And that's why it's so important to see things like Exponential Roadmap Initiative and others really leading this charge, because we need to go faster. If you look at, for example, at the rules around disclosing climate-related information, so companies began to do that on a voluntary basis 20 years ago or so. And over time, it became more and more official. Standards came forward, like the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, or more recently, the ISSB standards, which is the International Sustainability Standards Board. And now we're seeing governments begin to put that into requirements, right? So governments are requiring companies to disclose that information. But that whole kind of conveyor belt process, if you will, for disclosure took 20 years, and we need to go much faster. So governments will need to step up and create both the level playing field and the enabling environment that's going to permit companies to not just make these targets, but actually deliver them.
Now, Arunabha, if we go, there's another element maybe that's coming up, and that's going on in a consultation that the UNFCCC, or the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Secretariat there is doing. So there's a consultation going on net zero recognition and accountability to deliver a framework. And that work is building really on the work of the high-level expert group that you were a member of, Arunabha. What are your main expectations on that work?
I think what we have coming out of the report that we put out last year, and now this recognition accountability framework, is really a focus on, if you were a committed company or a committed financial institution, what's the checklist that you need to follow? What do you, point by point by point, what do you need to do, and make sure that you're aligned with that? But really, the broader expectation, the political expectation, is that it creates a positive reinforcing effect, right? That unlike the market failure that we have, that often the bad drives out the good, here the good crowds in the better. That should be the really important metric or benchmark against which this recognition and accountability framework will then unfold, right? So you recognize what you're doing, you hold those who are not following it to account, but then you're crowding in more and more of the positive action. That's really the biggest expectation from this.
So it's supposed to be working a little bit the carrot and stick, right? The recognition is part of the picture. And Anna, I'd like to ask you from a company perspective, what kind of recognition and for what helps you, including maybe within your company, to drive that action that we need to see?
Well, I think there are many things, but as you spoke about earlier about reporting and sharing and the data for a long time, we've done that, and someone has been looking at them, but it's just recently that we've actually been asked about the questions. And I think that is one of the things that actually gains traction and movement. But what's also happened the last years is that investors and clients have been starting to not just ask questions, but also scrutinize the data and ask why we have reported like we have, and what do you include in Scope 3? That was not a question earlier. Why do you include what you have in Scope 3? Do you have a science-based target? And so on and so on. And I think when those questions starts to come, that's when the whole company and the business becomes dependent on the sustainability movement, and I would say.
Thanks. And Johan, from the initiative standpoint then, that gathers several companies, recognition and accountability, what do you think, or what is your idea how that can deliver better, more credible climate action from companies?
Well, first we need to get this level playing field. This is really essential for the front runners as well, that we actually have a basic standard and we have independent assessments to get away from, greenwashing, which basically is really destructive for climate action as far as I see it. So that is really important to get that in place. Then I think if we can achieve that sort of exponential ask from companies going to their first tire supplier, which goes to their second tire supplier, basically the same ask that you should have targets in place, such as halving by 2030, for example, net zero targets, and then you should pass on these requirements backwards in your chain. The same thing will happen now when we ask our companies, go to your banks, because you have a lot of cash in your bank, ask your bank to ensure that you also have targets in place, and also ask that to your customers, we're using our money to lend it out to other parties. That is really a grand strategy as far as we see it. Is we can achieve that exponential ask across the value chains, we can move much faster, and relating to what Tom said before. So apart from setting like a basic plane, we also really need to get this race to the top going, where companies start to compete actually on going in the front line and being rewarded for that.
Now, transparency is one of the big words that comes up there a lot, together with recognition and accountability. And John, your work shows that there's even some confusion around, not so much transparency, maybe around all the different initiatives that are assessing credible climate action.
Yes, of course.
Thanks.
Yes, thanks, Andrea. So Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, actually says that net zero suffers from a deficit of credibility and a surplus of confusion. And so at the tracker, what we're trying to do is we're trying to address both of those things in tandem. So one of the initiatives that we have started on is what we call signposting. And that's actually signposting to other voluntary initiatives in this ecosystem. So for example, our partners, New Climate Institute, they do a report, issue a report every year called the Corporate Climate Responsibility Monitor. And they actually do deep dives into the biggest companies in the world. And we signpost to their ratings of whether a company has low integrity or high integrity. So that's just an example of what we're wanting to do and roll out across more of the ecosystem to make a user, make it easier for a user to actually know who's assessing what.
Thanks. I'm waiting for one more guest here, Sarah Bloom-Raskin, co-chair of the consultation on the recognition and accountability framework, who will be coming and joining us on the stage shortly. So let me just check where we are. And there's a little bit time for us to go into maybe the biggest, well, one of the biggest topics here at COP, which is fossil fuel phase out. Now, obviously, that's something that countries here are discussing, the producer, and there's very different views, obviously, and we don't know yet at the beginning of this COP where this will come out on and what language and it will maybe find its way into an agreement. But if we now look at companies specifically, Arunabha, the recommendations coming from the high-level expert group, what did they say on a fossil fuel phase-out?
The recommendations were very clear. Firstly, it referred to all fossil fuels, not just cherry-picking the ones that you don't like and hold on to the ones that you can't get rid of. It was very clear for coal, no more expansion of new mines, but in terms of shutting down coal-based power by 2030 in developed countries and by 2040 in developing countries. For oil and gas, again, no more exploration of new oil and gas, no more expansion of the existing reserves or extension of the production. Now, at the same time, I mean, those were the recommendations, but I think what has happened is that in the context of the urgency of energy insecurity, the urgent has trumped the important. And I think what we need to do now is also contextualize our actions in terms of what is it that we can do to double down or triple down, as is being discussed, on renewables, rather than just putting out a recommendation that we know is, sadly getting ignored. So it's very, very important that the phasing down or phasing out of fossil fuels coincides with a massive ramp up of renewables so that the energy access and energy security imperative is not compromised. Otherwise, it's politically untenable.
Thank you. I do believe that the net zero tracker showed that, that's not really something that companies are looking at in much detail at all yet, the fossil fuel phase out. Is that correct?
No, that's right. We actually ran a pilot in our June stocktake against all our fossil fuel companies in the database. So we had 114, and not a single one have indicated that they're going to move away from fossil fuels by 2050, let alone this century. And actually, we are releasing an analysis on Monday. We are going to host a press conference here, and we're actually rolling that pilot out across our whole database. So all those entities with net zero targets. So we'll be able to tell you more from Monday.
Thank you so much for that. Just very briefly, before we have Sarah coming and joining us on the stage here, what's the one main challenge for a company to even begin thinking about what fossil fuel phase out means?
I think it's about understanding the scope of it. We have, when we talk about our own emissions that we, like in our scope 2, then it's fairly straightforward, as I said earlier. When it comes to scope 3 in our supply chain, that's where it becomes complicated. There's no other way. It has to be done, but it's not always so easy.
Thank you for explaining that, Anna. And now welcome. Oops, something happened here with whatever installation you have. Thank you so much for saving me here. Let's just hear whether the microphone is working. So it might not be. Is there any indication here from Stockholm whether you're still hearing me? Thank you. Thanks so much for helping out here, everyone. So thank you so much for joining us here. Sarah Bloom Raskin, co-chair of the consultation on the UNFCCC Net Zero Recognition and Accountability Framework, a professor at Duke University School of Law, and a former Deputy Secretary at the US Treasury. Welcome here, Sarah.
Very happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Delighted that you made it through the heat and maze that we have here around us. So you've spent the past few months listening and learning, I think is what it said in your newsletter, from companies like Skanska here, also from cities, from financial institutions, basically from all these non-state actors, and also from initiatives like ours, Exponential Roadmap Initiatives. What key points are emerging from this learning process, and when it comes to the key blockers really to faster and better climate action from companies?
Yes, right. And you're so right, Andrea. We've been doing a lot of listening, much listening, talking to all sorts of firms all across the world of different sizes, engaged in different things, not just the financial sector firms, but firms that are engaged in things like transportation, in housing, pharmaceuticals, manufacturing, of all different sizes. And we've been talking to them in different ways so that we can draw out good information. And the information that we are hearing about really is what is keeping them from doing even more, right, in terms of making net zero commitments and being able to show progress against those commitments, and having those commitments mean something, having them be something that's credible, that's recognized for good progress. And so it's been quite a listening session, quite a tour, and we're still in the middle of it. So we're still taking it in.
But we're still trying to tease out a little bit from you what's emerging.
Yeah.
And one of the aspects that we talked about earlier was this question of governance, right? And who's governing net zero? And your consultation also looked into that and looked at what role the UNFCCC or other UN bodies could really play in catalyzing progress. So what are you hearing?
Right. So one thing we're hearing is the decarbonization transition journey is happening. It is in the midst of quite a bit of momentum, but firms are in different stages along it, right? So some firms have actually established net zero pledges, made commitments, and are moving towards them. Others haven't even begun. And those that are either, haven't begun or really want to be more ambitious are finding different obstacles. And to get to your question, Andrea, one of the early obstacles that firms have as they begin the journey is one of information, getting the right data. Having data that is accessible, that is usable, that is relevant to helping them set a target that's going to be meaningful, right? So the idea here is to have data and information that will be useful to them.
You mentioned that your consultation is still ongoing.
Yes, it is.
And of course it is examining all these issues around recognition, accountability. It's not yet done. You have further consulting to do. But when it comes to accelerators, what are some of the key points that you're hearing there?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that we hear and continue to hear is, again, the importance of data. how data and having the right information is necessary for setting a target, for actually wanting to begin a net zero kind of transition. So data, absolutely critical. And what kind of data? Data that is interoperable, data that is, not behind a firewall. I mean, we're talking here, the entire world, and there are businesses that can't afford to actually pay for privatized data. They actually need to have data that is accessible to them. And then thinking about also technical expertise. This idea of doing something in the net zero frame isn't something that is accessible and easily found at every single firm. So having the right talent and human resources at places is also actually a critical barrier.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for joining us here and giving us a few glimpses into this, into the work that's ongoing there in this consultation on the recognition and accountability framework of the UNFCCC. And I'd ask you to stay here on the stage while I'll just put a last question really to all our panelists. And that would be to finish just one sentence. The single most important way in which recognition and accountability can accelerate credible climate action from companies is through, you go first, Anna.
Yeah, I think it is through the right people asking the right questions.
That's simple enough. There's many of us who are asking questions. Arunabha, you go next.
I think the single biggest accelerator can be in an architecture to verify the verifiers. Once we have that at scale, then immediately the data becomes credible, and immediately the actions that the data is verifying becomes credible, and then you crowd in, as I was saying earlier, the good, and from the good you crowd in the better.
John, you want to go? Oh, yeah.
Sure. I would say closing the gaps on data and credibility. The way I think about climate change is there are 4 big gaps. One on action, one on finance, one on data, and one on credibility. And at the Net Zero Tracker, we'd try to address the last 2 gaps. So that's where my focus would be.
What about you?
I'd point toward regulation and creating a level playing field, but also the enabling environment that helps every company deliver on the targets that it's set.
Thank you. Johan.
Yeah, we need to make target setting, having credible targets and action, business as usual across basically all businesses. At the same time, we need to accelerate the race to the top between the winners. That's a twofold strategy. That would be a winning strategy.
Thank you so much, everyone. Now, I realize that we have 10 minutes left in this session, which is rather extraordinary, given that we have 6 people here, experts, which I must say I admire how concise everyone is today, which is not maybe the rule. So we could go into maybe an outlook type of question where we look at what messages need to be coming and would be helpful as the negotiations are now going on among country leaders. So what message as a company, maybe Anna, do you want to send that you feel would be helpful to an ambitious outcome here at COP28? And do feel free to take your time.
Oh, thank you. That's, yeah, I'll try to keep short anyway. But I think one of the biggest challenges is what we have all mentioned already is about the data and the quality of the data and the standardization and lack of harmonization. As a company operating in many different countries and markets, it becomes obviously really quick when we're trying to gather data that the regulations, national regulations and policies, for example, how to measure energy or what emission factors to use when calculating carbon footprint or the definition of net zero. Some countries actually have, to get a building permit, you need to have a preliminary carbon calculation, and that looks really different in all of our different markets, which means that for us it's really hard to say something about our data as a common, as a group, as a company, but we can say stuff in our all different markets. But I would love, because I'm one of those architects trying to figure out how to measure and get the right quality of our data. I would love if we could have a more harmonized way of talking about the data, standard national legislation, and yeah, just trying to be able to compare and talk about the data in a way where we don't need to always take into account that there are different ways of measuring the data that we're using. So, yeah.
Is that something, Tom, sorry, may I ask you to share the mic? Is that something, Tom, that the COP, let's say, could deliver?
Well, I think the COP is going to deliver, I hope, a strong message in response to the global stocktake, which, as many will know, is the first time countries have come together under the Paris Agreement to say, how are we doing on these targets we've set for ourselves collectively, and what more needs to be done? And I think the message is already very clear that we need to do more, we need to do it much more quickly. But the message I hope will also come out of this global stocktake is that we can do a lot more. And indeed, some things are already happening, which are very exciting. And that's an important message as well, because it gives us not just sort of naive hope for the future, but actually a concrete set of steps we can take to deliver on that scaling up of speed and ambition and implementation, especially, that we need. And I think the regulation I'm talking about is one of those pieces. So as I was saying before, disclosure is now becoming the norm in many parts of the world. If you look at the G20, for example, 9 of the G20 members have some kind of sustainability disclosure in their rules, varied on how they are, but 9 have some kind of rules. 9 more are in the process of developing those rules, talking only about the national level here, and 2 others are maybe going to hopefully start soon. But if you look across many domains, so not just data, but say transition plan requirements or procurement rules or advertising claims or trade rules, you're seeing this kind of net zero concept actually weaving through the fabric of the economy overall. And for countries here at COP, they can actually point to that trend and say, look, we've set these targets. Companies have also set their targets. We're not on track, but if we actually create this level playing field, if we actually build this enabling environment and reshape the incentives that these regulations are creating, we can make progress, and there's progress we already see is becoming apparent because of that. So I think that's, I hope, the message the global stocktake will really land with countries, companies, and all of us here at COP.
Thanks, and because there's no, John, there's no point really in only companies doing net zero, right? We need to see a global net zero, and that's so you're in your net zero stocktake are assessing all actors against net zero. So what's on that interaction between company net zero and the global net zero and the country level decision makers? What's the connection here, and what can be helpful that can come out of conversations like these?
Yeah, it's precisely why we track nations, regions, cities, and companies to give a comprehensive view of the whole of the economy. You could think of it like a sandwich. You need that top down and that bottom up. So actually, one of the best things we found in the stocktake was that the net zero targets going into policy documents and into law grew over 2 years from 7% to 75%. And that shows that nations are taking this seriously. And so entrenching that in law and in policy documents shows companies the direction of travel. There's no going back on this.
Now, Sarah, there are things that you can say and that you cannot say, given the role that you're in. I would like to ask you, from your personal experience as a policymaker, what are the kind of messages emerging from the private sector that were helpful to your decision making?
Yeah, so the private sector, as we talk to businesses, they do want a sense of policy certainty, right? They do find that it's easier to invest in the future, in particular transition technologies or certain processes, if they have a stable, predictable, and enabling, and I should also add equitable, policy framework. And so what businesses look for is they look for that. They need that, okay? And of course, different jurisdictions have different policy settings that they are deploying. But whatever those settings are, the business sector needs them. They need to know that they are there and that they can be enabling. And of course, for firms that want to accelerate, and we want to see acceleration, you want to see policy settings that permit, that actually enable that acceleration. Okay, and you want that for not just the confidence that businesses get when they have it, but also being allowing businesses to be recognized for what they've done, right? Because of course, this is, these big jumps to, to net zero have to be happening in little bite-sized pieces, and those pieces have to be recognized and assessed, and course has to be, sort of reset now and then. So, so I think the policy realm is critically important here.
And thank you, Sarah, for answering that question. Arunabha, we look back at what the high-level expert group delivered in terms of recommendations. We took stock of where we are now, and now looking forward, maybe even to the next COP. Where do you want to see net zero integrity from companies then, and how would that enable countries to take better decisions?
Well, one of the things that we brought out was in the recommendations was that your interim targets need to begin from 2025. So really, it's just 2 years to go to be credibly, to credibly make a case that you belong inside the room. As the Secretary General, when he hosted the Climate Ambition Summit in September, made it very clear only those who are aligning with these recommendations should be coming into into the room. Now, what needs to happen between now and say next year or 2025? Number one, I would like to see more of that positive reinforcement that Sarah was also referring to, or Tom was referring to, because I think it's not about creating just a fluffy positive story, but I think seeing that there are certain companies or jurisdictions that are able to navigate this complexity and recognizing the complexity and yet being able to see I can make some progress, then lends some confidence to the others to also step up. That's one thing. The second thing that I would really want is a de-risking of investment in the emerging markets. Because without that, your scope 2, scope 3, your larger just transition just does not pan out and becomes difficult for companies that are operating across different geographies and difficult for countries to make credible claims for what they want to achieve.
Thank you, Johan. The one thing I think that the point that I would like to hear from you is on the picking up on the race to the top between companies and countries. Can you spell that out very briefly?
I can do that. But first, I'd like to say for this particular COP, it's so incredibly important that we start the journey to phase out all fossil fuels. So to put an enormous pressure on that, and also from all companies, that we are encouraging companies actively now phasing out all the fossil fuels through their value chains, which is happening. So that's a clear signal to finance, to countries. It's time to phase out fossil fuels. But we won't be able to do that, to connect to what you said, Arunabha, unless we scale up the solutions to shift out the old economy. We need to scale up the substitutes, and we need to scale them much, much faster, maybe 2-5 times faster. Renewable energy efficiency is scaling, but we have to go much faster. We have 10 other solutions which we need to get on the same exponential Moore's law trajectory as well. So I think that will be incredibly important, the next upcoming COPs, to get the up curve going as well.
Thank you, everyone here, for sharing your insights on where we are, on accountability for companies in their net zero commitments, and on how recognition and accountability can accelerate credible climate action from companies. That's it from the Exponential Roadmap Initiative for today. Join us again tomorrow, and now stay tuned here for more from Stockholm. Over to you, Katarina.
Well, thank you so much, Andrea and guests. What a great session. Let's now move on to the next.